Before I get too far, I'd like to thank Ed McDonough and Lily Z for their continuing patronage on Patreon. So if you get some value out of this video, a like, share, anything like that would be absolutely great and super appreciated. And then if you're really getting something out of the content consistently, consider joining Ed and Lily and a few other folks and joining my Patreon. Thank you very much. Hey all, Blake here. And this week, I'm going to be doing a little bit about some quality of life editor extensions that I wrote. It makes the code much cleaner, easier to read, easier to work with, or it just takes care of some of the routine stuff that I'm tired of doing every single time I start up a project, like some of the events and things like that. So I have all of this code out on GitHub, right? And so I'll go ahead. The URL on that one is nice and long, so I'll send that out or attach it onto the description of the video so that you can see that. But I do want to just walk through what some of these editor extensions are, what they do, why I wrote them. I did this, something like this, a month or two back. I had some editor extensions and we worked on cached components, right? Because that was one thing that I'm constantly trying to do is find a component, refine the component, but I don't want to impact performance as much. And that got into creating, special classes, child classes of mono behaviors and stuff like that. This is going to be a lot more simpler in terms of implementation, right? A lot more simple in terms of implementation. These are going to be, these methods try to mimic much of the code style that's already in Unity, and they're just adding functionality that I thought Unity was missing. So in some cases, I'm just going to show you examples because I have example scenes in the project. In other cases, I'm actually going to type some stuff up so that you can see how it compares and contrasts with kind of the existing Unity code. So some of the first stuff I'm going to be looking at are just events, right? So often, if you're using the Unity engine events, it only comes with the Unity event with no argument. And so the first thing I did was I just like ints, floats, strings, booleans, vector2s, vector3s, game objects, quaternions, transforms. These are all the things that I'm constantly passing in with Unity events. And I'll pass them around. I'll trigger them from one place to another. And so it kind of drove me nuts that they didn't already exist. You have to define them, even though the capacity to do so is already easily there. But what happens is, I'm working on one thing, and then I need to pass a string in an event, and then that's when I realize that I haven't written my Unity event string class yet. And then, so I just tack it into the beginning of an unrelated file instead of, going back to the editor and creating a new C# class to hold all of the event types, which you should be doing. And then, putting it in there and marking it serializable and, all of that. I just put it in line or as close to inline as I can because I'm working on another problem and I don't want to take the 5 minutes to do the context switch because then I'll have to context switch back to what I was actually focused on. So I just said, screw it. I'm just going to write all of these up. So I would say this is probably 99% of all the event classes that I've ever needed. And these are all just, immediate derivatives of the Unity event, the standard one. And you would use them the way that you would any, just a normal Unity event. So, so we'll just create an empty game object, right? And then I'll create just a new folder here for examples, and there's already another folder there, but I'll just show you how quick and easy it is to do this. Test script 1, right? And so bring that buddy, come on, compile, there we go, onto the game object, all right? And then we can just say public Unity event int, right? My int event. And that should be that, right? That should be all there is to it. It'll pop up here in a second as soon as we compile. Poof, there it is. My event in 32, list is empty. And now you can invoke that like you normally would, right? And so, you can have in your normal C# code, right, start, you can say debug. Well, let's see. So we'll do a public void log int my int, right? And so we're just going to do a quick debug log int message was sent. Right, and so we can do that, and we can kind of test our own thing, because we can say, all right, at runtime, I am going to refer to myself, and I'm going to go to test script 1, and I'm going to log whatever int I pass, right? And so maybe just in my start, I'm going to do if my int event is not equal to null, and this is a required check, right? My int event dot invoke, and then we'll just pick a number, and I put that in as a string because, you know, recording video. Right, and then I hit play, and poof, you know, an int message was sent 99. So, you know, on start, it sends this int event, right? It goes out to anybody who's subscribed to the int event here, which in this case was itself, and then the login script, which is down here. So the int pipe works, and that looks awesome. Now, the other part that I noticed, though, is this syntax, after a while, get a little tired of writing this because we always have this conditional and whatnot. And even though it rarely is not true, I have had cases where I've forgotten to initialize up here, and so it does cause a problem. Your code, if you don't do that null check, any code after it may not execute, depending on how everything is set up or why it didn't, why this line didn't run. But you know, in the case that my int event is null, I'm pretty sure that anything following that would not execute. So I said, you know, I'm tired of writing this all the time. So what I do is I have also added an editor extension so that I can just do GameObject dot trigger, and then we'll say my int event and 97. Right, so this is another editor extension. It just kind of cleans things up, and it says do this, right? And then if this doesn't exist, it won't run it. Right, and so I can fire that bad boy, and so we can see, you know, 99, 97, or we can also do trigger, right? We know that one's going to be null, and then 43, right? So in this case, we are triggering something that we know is null, and then we're going to see that it should give us a warning, right? Try to invoke a null Unity event with type system at 32 with the following payload, right? And there's the payload, 43, right? So that gives you an idea of, you know, I tried to do this, and here's where I am, and here's the payload, but you know, I wasn't able to do because that Unity event was null. The one thing I'm actually going to do right now, while I'm looking at it, is I'm going to include the GameObject name. So that way you can track down, you know, where did this error message come from, right? So try to invoke a null Unity event with type system at 32, and we'll have the name of the game object in there. So that'll help you track it down. It's like, oh, why am I getting those messages? Where are they coming from? Instead of just kind of failing and saying, oh, I can't run this code. So that's the events stuff that I put in. All right, let's see, what's next? Let's take a look here at editor extensions. Range. Oh yeah, that's another good one. You know what? I will bring back this game object. Range is another one. I write this code all the freaking time. So I just public those. There. Okay, so range int, range float. All right, so these are a couple of variables, and then due to its protection level. What? So, having made a couple of changes live as I do this stream, if you find any issues with any of these extension classes, let me know. Or if there's things that you want to add to it, give me a pull request. All right, so we have this game object, should have a couple of ranges. Now here we go, my range, minimum, maximum, right? Float range, minimum 0 to 1. The only thing I don't have in the code here that I would like to add, but I just haven't had time to futz with it, and this is another thing if somebody wants to add this. I don't have any UI if the minimum is less than the maximum, or sorry, the minimum is more than the maximum. I feel like there should be at least a warning there. I do think switching things around and whatnot might be a little too invasive, because if you're working and saying, oh, I want it to be 100 to 1,000, right? I don't want it to flip those two numbers. But I at least wanted to give a warning. But this is, as you would expect, right? My range, minimum to maximum. My float range, minimum to maximum. There is also, though, public range color, my color range. Which also needs the constructor to be public. Okay. And so that gives you a minimum color and a maximum color. These work as you would expect, and then they also have in them, we have our test script here. So maybe we will use our working trigger code, right? No, that's right. And then we will say my range dot random in range. And so that uses the Unity random stuff, but this gives you a random int in the range that you have specified, so that you don't have to worry about some of the code and whatnot. Like, it's already there. You've defined the range, and so you can see every time that I play it, it comes up with a new random integer. So I have these examples and a couple more in the extensions ranges. I don't want to save that. Don't save it. Because this also demonstrates, yeah, so random RGBA colors, and then floats and ints are all provided as examples in this case. Let's see what we have. That is ranges, that is events. The editor, that's for the range. So again, if anybody wants to go in and change how the editor treats the range, there you go. Please be my guest. Editor extensions aren't super my thing. Like, I know enough to get by, but if you know more, please feel free to hop in there and take my mediocre code and make it awesome. So events we've already talked about. Let's talk about transforms, and I already have a scene that is set up for this. One of the things that people use a lot when they start using Unity is transform.lookAt, right? And they use it all the time. It was like, oh, I want to look at this, right? And then they put a quad in the scene, and they do transform.lookAt, and the quad looks the wrong way. I don't know why quads look backwards, but as a one-sided object, I would expect that when you do a look at, that one side looks at whatever you're looking at. But of course it doesn't. So the thing that I end up writing a lot, again, it's one of those scripts that is, oh yeah, I got to write this again, right, is look away from. And so I have a look scene. So you can see in here, and first I'm just going to disable those two so we can talk about these. Right, so we have look at, which we do all the time, and then we have look away from, and these are both happening instantaneously. And so look away from, right, is gonna look. It's an extension on transform, and so it's going to look exactly like you would expect, right? So this is the standard Unity transform.lookAt, and so I added transform.lookAwayFrom. That's all there is to it. In addition, many times what people do is they say, all right, well, I want to do a look at, and then I want to do something over time. Well, look at happens on the game object as soon as you call look at, and it doesn't provide you the quaternion rotation of that look at. So you can't like say, all right, what would my rotation be as if I were looking at something, right? And the same with look away. And so in this case, what I've done in this code is we have transform.look at rotation and look away from rotation. So this says if I'm this game object and I want to look at that game object, this is the rotation that I would need if I were to look at it, so that you can linearly interpolate between the two nice and smoothly. Now, is that just a little bit of position math with the built-in quaternion method under the hood? Yes, it is. Absolutely. That is all it is. It is a one-liner, right? It should be anyway. Yes, one-liner, right? Quaternion.look rotation, self.position minus target, right? Like that is all you need. However, for people that aren't working with quaternions very much, you're just like, oh yeah, what was that again? And then which position goes first and whatnot. It's way easier to just have a get look away from rotation, right? So it's just simple, easy to remember call that looks and acts just like you would expect based on what Unity has already put in there. We also, for look at, have added a couple of other aliases so that instead of doing a look at on a transform, you can do a look at on a game object. Again, is that just a dereference to the object's transform? Yes, absolutely. But it's just an overload of the method that I felt was overlooked by the Unity team. So I put it in there because why wouldn't I? Right? So these are all, again, just simplifying quality of life stuff. And it does add up, right? When you have a bunch of these little things, it does add up. And then so I'll bring these two online and I'll hide away instant and toward instant. So these are the two that are on a little bit of a delay, right? So that as this moves, right, it's getting what would the ideal rotation be. And you can see there's a bit of a delay as they rotate toward that, which is probably what most people really want in their games, as opposed to that super instant lock on or lock away from. Let's see here. So all fairly little stuff. Ranges, sample scene, look scene, events. All right. So now we're going to get to the real meat of one of the things that I've been working on. It changes how I do syntax a little bit, but I really, really like the extensions I've added for working with components. And in fact, all of this other stuff is, okay, it would be nice if Unity just put those like events in there so that we don't have to define them. It would be nice if Unity put look away from in there so that we didn't have to define them. This, I think, is actually a superior way to do a Git component because it's going to reduce errors, especially for those that are new to Unity. So what I've done is, instead of just doing a Git component where I, get a component or null back and then have to do a null check and then take an action, I've wrapped all of that together in an action so that basically you just say, hey, get component and do this with it, right? Or get the component, do this with it, or do this if the component doesn't exist. And so it's a much cleaner way to be able to do code. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new scene and demonstrate what the heck I'm talking about. And this is a disposable scene. All right, so we'll just call it blah. And we will create a, well, I don't want it to be totally empty, so I will create a cube. And so this is my cube. It has a box collider, it has a mesh renderer, does not have a rigid body. That's fine. All right, and we'll use this as our victim. So we'll bring this guy front and center in our scene, and we might, yeah. So we'll work with this one a little bit. So, and then I'll create a new test script. Capitalization is different than the first one, and it's going to bug me. All right, so here's test script 2. All right, so this is where we're going to do something a little different. First thing I'm going to do in this case, you know what? I'm going to add a rigid body. And then I'm going to go on test script 2, and I'm going to do a public float force. Right? And then in my start, I am going to say GameObject get component. And now here's where we vary a little bit. So normally, just for comparison, this is what I would do. Right, so we would do something like this. Right, and so I go back into Unity, and I'd go to my test script, and I'd add a force of 500, which should be sufficient to do something dramatic. Yep, there we go. Poof. Right. This syntax isn't bad, but what happens, especially for people who don't do a lot of Unity? They make the assumption, oh, this thing's always going to have the rigid body, right? And then they don't do this check. And so we're doing this assignment, and we're always doing this null check, or you're not doing this null check, and then you end up with code that doesn't execute, and you don't know why, or errors that you don't expect, something like that. So I said, there is a better way, and here it is. So we're going to say rigid body, and we're just using closures. Right, and we say oops, got an extra equal sign in there somehow. So these two pieces of code do the same thing, right? But this one is just automatically doing that null checking for you and says, do this if you succeed, right? And so we can go ahead. I will just remove that code for now. Boom, does the exact same thing. Right. The other thing that we can do with this, right, is because this is a lambda, right, with a get component, we can also have, what do we do if we don't have the component that we think we want, right? And so we can do debug.log, error, hey, that component is missing, right? So here's our if-else. It's automatically doing our null checking, and what it means is that we won't have any issues with null references to components. Right? Okay. And there it goes. I went extra high this time because I left both pieces of code in there, right? Yep. This get component also does return. the component if it exists, right? So instead of this, actually, I can just do, right, and then, you know, I can do whatever I want with my rigid body there. And so you can use it as you normally do and just have this for initialization and then cache it. Or you can just also, you know, for a lot of cases when we're working with renders or something like that, right, we just do it all internally to here. And that way we don't have variables out at this space, and we already have our null checking, and we know that our code is going to work. Because again, so often I'll see, right, GameObject.getComponent rigidBody.addForce. Like, I see this all the time. And again, that doesn't have the null check, which means the code is going to fail. Right? So debug.log. So in this case, if we have our cube and we remove the rigid body for some reason, right? Somebody's working in a prefab, especially with the new nested prefabs and stuff. Maybe it isn't quite composed the way that your code assumes that it is. And then you hit play, right? We'll get a couple of things, right? Hey, that component is missing. That's us gracefully identifying that it's gone. And then here we're getting the standard Unity error, you know, that doesn't exist, right? Which means that this won't run, didn't run, right? So we got this far in the code and then your script ended, and basically that, you know, that script on that game object has stopped working completely, right? But here, right, we were able to continue gracefully even though it wasn't there, because the null check is already in this Git component. So that's why I do it. I think if there's any of the editor extensions that I've written that are really, really useful, it's actually this simplified version of the Git component, because I don't usually do much in case there's a null. There is also a standard Git component required. And so that is, instead of defining my own error message, it just uses a default debug output and says, hey, that's not there. You know, we expected it to be there and it wasn't. The other thing that goes in part with this is I really like the syntax. I thought it worked really good. And so I wanted to keep going along that theme. And so what I have is, for the cases where you're working with arrays of objects, right? Perhaps you have a whole bunch of children render or something. You can do GameObject.get component in children, right? And so in this case, that's your standard Unity call. But then for component arrays, components in children, right? So this is get component in children is singular, get components in children is an array. So this is for any Unity array of components. You get components in children dot for each component, right? And so this does the same thing where we're going to do render ren, and then we're going to define. And so this is basically a for each in that array, and you don't have to do anything. It's already there for any array of a type that is a component. Right. So in this case, we're going to just, for all of the renders in a component, go and get their name. And this is just another safe way of doing the same kind of thing. So if I created some child objects or whatnot, right? I'll add a sphere and I'll add a capsule, right? And it just saves a for each loop and some null checking and all that good stuff. And then I can just boom, hit play. And this is cube, sphere, and capsule because it's doing that for each. and it uses the same syntax as the Git component. So those are a number of the extensions that I've added. Again, it's mostly quality of life stuff, but it does mean that your code is going to be more consistent. It means that it's going to go, or it also means that you just don't have to switch off of what you were doing to write that one, range class again. We've probably written it, a dozen times. And I just don't want to write it yet again. And so that's why I'm kind of collating all of these quality of life changes into one project that you can just easily download and put into your project. If there are things here that you think that could be improved, let me know. If there are things about Unity, the APIs and whatnot that Unity's put on there that you find frustrating, but you're not sure what software engineering techniques might be used to kind of streamline it, improve the quality of life for certain types of things, let me know. I'm happy to help, and then we can just add it to this library, and we can keep building it out and keep just improving and simplifying how it is that we interact with this. Because I think some of these, the Git component stuff in particular, but also the ranges and just having these events, stupid stuff like that really does help me focus on the problem that I'm trying to solve, as opposed to things that might be missing from the engine. So again, as always, a like, subscribe, share. Hugely helpful. And then if you're getting something out of these on a regular basis, I do encourage you to visit my Patreon and consider being a patron. I'm very grateful for my patrons. As it is, however it is that you support me, I am very grateful. Thank you all very much. And also thank you for being a very positive and supportive community. I really like seeing that in the comments. So it's really good stuff. Super appreciated. Any questions, any comments, thoughts, something like that, toss them in the comments below. And until next time, happy coding. You're here to interrupt the video, aren't you? Yes, you are. Who's my good boy? Here. There's your close-up. There's your close-up. Such a good lobster.